On this episode of Pilot's Discretion, our guest is helicopter instructor and journalist Elan Head. She talks about the current state of the eVTOL industry, the right lesson to learn from the Kobe Bryant crash, and the strangest helicopter she's ever flown. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm your host, John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties. If you like the podcast, please leave us a review in your favorite app. And remember, you can catch up on every previous episode by visiting sporties.com/podcast. You can also email us with your comments or guest ideas, podcast@sporties.com. Today, I'm joined by Elan Head, one of the aviation industry's most knowledgeable writers, especially on the topics of emerging technology and helicopter safety. She has written more than 100 articles for Vertical magazine over the last decade, and she is currently senior editor at the Air Current, where she covers advanced air mobility companies and electric aviation. It's really essential reading for anyone who wants to make sense of this fast-moving industry. If you haven't checked out the Air Current, I recommend it. She's also an experienced helicopter pilot and Gold Seal flight instructor who has flown a number of unique aircraft. Elan, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
You cover an exciting but also confusing world, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft, and the advanced air mobility companies that are built around those aircraft. This industry basically didn't exist a decade ago, and then there was this huge surge of excitement with the Uber Elevate project in 2016. Since then, a lot has changed, and you wrote recently, I thought, a very good summary of where we are. With the era of free money now over, investor skepticism is back, and the sector has been undergoing a sometimes awkward process of recalibrating expectations. So where would you say we are in that awkward process?
Great question. So it's a fascinating industry, and it's been a fascinating cycle watching it, emerge through the various stages of the hype cycle. I think where we are now is the industry is in the process of doing the hard work to get their aircraft to market. And if we step back, you mentioned the Uber Elevate project, and so for anyone who's not aware, back in 2016, Uber put out a white paper basically laying out this vision for electric aircraft that are going to whisk people around cities under this concept called urban air mobility. And Uber really served as a catalyst over the next few years. They had a series of summits, and they brought a lot of players together to really get enthusiasm and political support behind this idea of urban air mobility. So that played a very critical role in advancing this concept. I think the hype around the sector really came to a peak in early 2021. And this was at the peak of the SPAC craze. So special purpose acquisition companies were the vehicle by which a lot of these eVTOL companies listed on the public markets. And so SPAC, or a blank check company, is a company that's created and publicly listed for the sole purpose of finding a promising company and taking it public through a reverse merger. And they enjoyed a very brief, intense period of popularity. Again, around early 2021 was when this peaked. And they were especially popular with tech companies, not just eVTOL companies, all kinds of emerging tech companies, because of this widespread perception of something that SPACs were allowed to do that traditional initial public offerings were not. And so the idea was that because these SPACs were already publicly listed, they were able to make forward-looking projections that could project future revenues, for example, and they would be shielded from liability if these projections turned out to be incorrect, as long as they offered meaningful cautionary statements at the same time. And so what that allowed some of these technology companies to do is make very optimistic forward-looking projections of future revenues. And in the eVTOL space, an example of that was companies that had not actually flown an aircraft, but they were sure that by the end of the decade, they were going to have more revenues than, say, Airbus helicopters. And these visions were basically, not completely divorced from reality, but they projected a world in which everything that could possibly go right goes right. And eventually, the SEC stepped in. decided that, maybe the SPACs were getting ahead of themselves in terms of just how optimistic they could be with their forward-looking projections. And that, kind of popped the SPAC bubble. But for the brief period while it lasted, it was an amazing funding vehicle that gave a number of these companies a lot of money to play with. And now they're in the process of rapidly spending that money trying to build aircraft.
It does seem like a business that really has been driven by the investors. I suppose that's true of many industries, but less a customer driven or even in many ways technology driven, more an investor driven. In addition to the SPACs, I find it interesting that a lot of the companies piling in recently have been large, in many cases, aerospace companies. Delta invested in Joby, Boeing bought Wisk, Stellantis bought into Archer. Some big companies with established businesses in somewhat adjacent markets. What do you think their strategy is?
So it varies. And it's interesting you should say it's not a customer driven business, because that's true, because the customers don't really exist. A lot of this is speculating that there's going to be this brand new market for vertical flight that goes beyond anything helicopters are doing today. So it's a very speculative industry. I do think it is very much driven by the tech, because there's certainly some innovations that enable these types of vehicles to be created now. The battery technology, electric motors, autonomy. That's all advancing these new types of machines. But basically, everyone is placing bets on what this new technology could, potentially be good for. Um, Boeing is very interested in the autonomy aspect. That's something that we've reported on. There's ways in which their investment in Wisk can advance autonomy in some of their future commercial aircraft programs. Some of the airlines, Delta, United, they're looking at eVTOLs as a way to enhance their offering, especially for those premium customers who might take an eVTOL to the airport. If they can land behind security and skip the lines, that improves the customer experience quite a bit. But it's still very speculative, and everyone's trying to figure out what their specific angle might be.
What do you think the best customer or business model will be for these? There's talk about using them to deliver packages. There's the intra-city passenger transport. Something you've reported on recently is military interest in keeping these companies developing their products. Do you think military might end up being the first application of this, as we've seen with some other technologies, or is that more speculative?
Oh, it's all speculative. So the interesting aspect about the military is it's their interest is kind of twofold. So yes, they're interested in what they might possibly be able to do with eVTOLs, but the military, and especially the Air Force, interest in the eVTOL companies through the Agility Prime program was always intended to really support this emerging industry and help America compete against other countries, especially China, when it comes to developing this new type of technology. So, in an extent, it's something of a subsidy for the industry. Give them money, allow them to develop the tech, help them bridge the path to commercial operations. The military is still very interested in doing that and is still, throwing some money at these companies, but remains to be seen what roles eVTOLs can actually serve in the military space. In terms of what the use cases will be, if I if I knew that, I probably wouldn't just be writing about it. I would be vastly more successful. I think from my perspective, coming from the helicopter side of things, like it's obvious that there are already some existing markets for these types of vehicles. Whether that's flying people across cities, whether it's aerial tourism. So there's limited markets for that, and I think some of these eVTOLs will be well suited to those. And I think it'll be a process of gradually expanding those markets, trying new ones, figuring out what the right fit is for these aircraft.
It does seem like a lot of people involved in this industry are placing a lot of small bets just on the off chance that it works, that they'll have some skin in the game. And so for a larger company or even the military, it's not a big deal to invest. We'll throw a few $1,000,000 here and there, and if it works, we're in on the ground floor. But one other organization that has gotten into the act recently is the FAA, who is working to certify these new aircraft and relatedly how to certify the pilots who will fly them. I think you could say the FAA is moving cautiously. Some would say glacially, but they are moving with some recent news lately about the powered lift rating, this urban air mobility concept of operations, big, long documents that I don't recommend reading if you like exciting novels. But there's movement there. But I thought it interesting when you recently wrote that drone certification is a cautionary tale for eVTOLs. Why is that? And what is the lesson the eVTOL world should take from how the FAA approached drones?
Oh boy, good question. So, drone certification is a cautionary tale insofar as we don't really see a lot of drones flying around today. So, the projections of the drone industry, a decade ago, have not come to pass, and that's because the FAA has really struggled with figuring out how to fit them into the existing framework and what are the appropriate regulations and levels of certification and so forth. And it's not an exact parallel, but the FAA is certainly struggling with how to integrate these new eVTOL aircraft into their existing regulatory framework as well. And it's interesting contrast. Over in Europe, EASA basically looked at these new vehicles being developed, and they thought about, what's the best way to approach certifying and developing rules for these new types of aircraft. And they're like, we're going to start from scratch. And so they started from scratch and they wrote, brand new certification rules and operating rules for these aircraft. And they've been going through that process for a few years. The FAA has very much wanted to fit these aircraft into its existing regulatory framework, and that's created some challenges. So initially, the FAA was planning on certifying some of these winged eVTOLs, like the Joby and Archer vehicles, as Part 23 airplanes. And the idea was we'll certify them as airplanes under, the performance-based rewrite of Part 23 rules, write some special conditions where required, and away we go. But some people within the FAA didn't like that idea. And there was a long power struggle over a period of about 4 years. And eventually, the people within the FAA who thought that, no, these aircraft should be certified as powered lift prevailed. So powered lift was a category that was defined way back in 1997 when it looked like the 609 tilt rotor, civil tilt rotor, might actually come to market in a reasonable time frame. Of course, it did not. So they created this category, but never wrote any operating rules for it. And so now the FAA is trying to shoehorn eVTOLs into this powered lift category. They recently issued a proposed special federal aviation regulation for the powered lift category. Comments on that actually closed August 14th. And actually, there's a lot of drama in the comments, so it's not a completely boring read. But industry sees a lot of problems with this framework, so it's a struggle now to really figure out a path forward.
One of the more interesting news stories out of this whole world that I think flew under the radar a little bit has been Beta in this company up in the Northeast U.S. We've had them on the show here, has pivoted from what looks like a classic eVTOL aircraft to more of a traditional airplane design for now. What looks to me like sort of designing a minimum viable product instead of a dream machine. And that makes me wonder about some of the spillover effects from this investment boom for us regular GA pilots. Do you think there are benefits for electric aviation beyond the VTOL part of it that might help me fly an electric airplane? Is that more likely in the next 5 years because of some of what's going on here?
Oh, absolutely. So I think the reason why we've seen so much innovation in the eVTOL space first is, again, going back to Uber Elevate, which was very effective at building up investor enthusiasm for and hype around like these urban air taxis. So a lot of investment money went into building these urban air taxis. But the development of electric motors and batteries like to enable flight, that's going to benefit all small aircraft. So Beta, as you mentioned, they started out planning to certify an eVTOL aircraft, and they're still planning on that. But the whole shift to powered lift on the FAA's part influenced this decision as well. They saw how difficult and uncertain that path was getting, and they'd already designed an aircraft that was flying as an airplane. So they have a simple design that can basically, it's called a lift plus cruise design, so it can fly like an airplane, and then you have lifting rotors on top that allow you to land and take off vertically. They'd already done a number of flights all across the eastern U.S. really with pilots inside this aircraft flying as an airplane. Finally, they decided, let's just certify this first as an airplane. And so that's the path they're engaged on now, even though they continue to work on their eVTOL project as well. And so, the interesting thing about Beta, it's a real aircraft. So it's an aircraft with people inside flying significant distances, a couple hundred miles at a time, flying cross countries, already operating in the National Airspace System. So, yeah, I think, it really kind of points to a future where you will start seeing a lot more electric airplanes, as well as some of these more exotic eVTOL aircraft.
And what do you think that would change about general aviation? Does that fundamentally alter the economics of flying an airplane when it's electric, or is it just a smoother, quieter, lower carbon footprint option? What are the as an operator, an owner, maybe even a flight school, what do you think a design like that would actually change?
There's definitely a hope that it will dramatically change the economics. So the idea is, not only if you can get away from having to pay for fuel for each flight, but if you can get this, very expensive, complicated, maintenance-prone, combustion engine out of the aircraft, replace that with a very simple electric motor, then you're going to realize a lot of, maintenance and cost savings on that side as well. So the hope is that these electric aircraft will ultimately be a lot cheaper to operate. In addition to not having the emissions and the lead emissions and so forth that conventional aircraft do today.
Elan, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, let's talk about helicopters.
A portable radio can be a lifesaver during an emergency. But there's no time for instruction manuals or complicated adapter cables. That's why the pilots at Sporty's designed the PJ2 Plus and L6 COM radios, the only radios with built-in aviation headset jacks. These simple and reliable radios let you plug right in and stay focused on flying. The PJ2 Plus features twin PJ jacks, while the L6 has a 6-pin LEMO plug for panel-powered headsets. Both are available for under $300. Visit sportys.com/radios to order. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Elan Head, who, before she started covering the eVTOL industry, logged a lot of time as a helicopter flight instructor and has written numerous interesting articles about aviation safety. So, Elan, let's start with a very high-profile example from the helicopter world that airplane pilots will know, and that's the Kobe Bryant accident. What is the lesson we should learn from a safety standpoint from that very high-profile and tragic accident?
So the lesson that I wish the industry would learn is that everything that the industry had done to try to prevent that type of accident from happening didn't work. And primarily what the industry had done was to tell pilots to make good choices. Don't fly into the clouds. And at the same time, putting them into a system where they are, routinely put in positions where it's difficult, to make those good choices. And since the accident, I don't think we've seen a lot of change. There's still very much emphasis on pilots being ultimately responsible for whether or not they fly in the clouds, and yet at the same time there's an expectation in the helicopter industry that you're going to go out and get the mission done in very low visibility, and that pressure is still there, and as a result we still see the same types of accidents continue to happen.
What's the low-hanging fruit here? Is it new avionics, more IFR flying, better training, two pilots? Is there something that the helicopter industry just needs to adopt and is reluctant to, or is it a difficult problem with many different answers?
Well, I think what the industry has tried to do is pick the low-hanging fruit in terms of, telling pilots like stay out of the clouds and, putting out videos and so forth that are easy and simple and most importantly, don't cost operators or manufacturers anything. So I think it is a complex problem, and fundamentally at the root of it is that human beings just are not well equipped to manage a highly unstable aircraft like a helicopter in reduced or visibility. That's just not something that human beings are capable of doing very well. It's something that, with a lot of focus and when you're at the top of your game, you can hold it together for a while. But fundamentally, you need a stable aircraft. You need the right equipment to fly IFR in a helicopter, and most importantly, I think you need a system to fly IFR. So the IFR system in the U.S., most parts of the world, it's designed for airplanes, and it's very effective for airplanes, and that's why you have a lot of small airplanes that can go out and fly IFR, and it's normal and accepted. But things like altitudes and reserve requirements and so forth, those aren't practical for helicopters. And there's not a lot of low altitude IFR infrastructure that exists for helicopters. So it really becomes this kind of chicken and egg thing where the tools you need to safely fly IFR don't exist. But because the industry has evolved in the absence of those tools, there's not the financial incentive to develop them. So the helicopter industry kind of continues to be at this VFR stalemate that results in a lot of accidents like the Kobe Bryant crash.
I remember when I first started flying helicopters maybe 12 years ago, I was shocked at how little IFR flying went on in helicopters. Coming from the airplane world where anytime the weather was bad, I was going IFR. I didn't think twice about it. I was shocked at how little that happens. But you're absolutely right about the infrastructure and the system not really being designed with that in mind as much. I know another topic you've written on this subject is safety management systems, probably one of those low-hanging fruit topics where we can do something without really doing something sometimes. And you called out the, quote, SMS Industrial Complex, which is a phrase I absolutely adore and will steal. So I think I agree with you, but first tell me what you mean by that and why you're skeptical.
Oh, okay. So first of all, I'll qualify this by saying I think safety management systems are a great concept and they can be very useful, when they're implemented by conscientious operators who already care about safety. The thing is, it's very difficult. There are no real objective standards for how well your SMS is functioning. People try to come up with objective standards, but at the end of the day, an SMS only functions as well as your organization wants it to and is committed to making it. So again, in the sense of, as you said, low-hanging fruit, instead of mandating these really difficult and expensive things like let's create a low altitude IFR structure for helicopters. The FAA can say something like, let's mandate safety management systems for all Part 135 operators. And that's not necessarily going to help in the absence of the tools and the investments and the commitment to safety that combine to create safe operations. In terms of the SMS Industrial Complex, well, if you create a requirement that is largely paperwork based, then an industry will spring up to satisfy that paperwork based requirement. And as a result, you have a lot of consultants who make a lot of money. Again, many of them doing great work, legitimately helping companies make safer operations, and some of them not so much. And it's really hard to draw a clear objective line between those two.
There's a lot of talk right now about the pilot shortage in the airplane world, but this is also an issue in the helicopter world. Give us a sense of how serious that is and how long-term that has been in the helicopter industry.
Well, a lot of helicopter pilots are going to the airlines now. so yes, it's definitely a problem in the industry. I think it's always been a problem in the helicopter industry is how do you build the right type of experience, because a lot of jobs in the helicopter industry are very specialized and require a lot of specific training and experience, and so Yes, there's that kind of longstanding like structural issue, and then an acute problem, caused by the pilot shortage in the airlines. A lot of experienced helicopter pilots are, getting their airplane training, or if they already know how to fly airplanes, just going over to the airlines. So that's creating an issue for the helicopter industry as well.
Okay, Elan, at the end of every one of these episodes, we always close with a lightning round called Ready to Copy. So I'll ask some questions on a variety of topics, and you give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
I'm ready to copy.
Good, because we want to do more IFR flying. So here we go. Archer and Joby say we'll have certified eVTOL aircraft flying by 2025. The FAA recently hinted that maybe 2028 is more realistic. What is your prediction?
Oh, it's possible that they could be flying by 2025. I would not, be surprised to see that slip by a year or two. Certification programs never go exactly as planned.
It's 2035, and we are writing a review of the AAM market or the eVTOL market or whatever we call it in 2035. Which companies have survived and are on top? What are the Cessna Beach Piper or the Boeing Airbus of this new industry?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm gonna say again, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't necessarily be working as a journalist. I would be making stock picks. I don't know. I think it's highly likely that some of the front runners today, like Joby and Beta, could be very well established and successful companies by then. And then I think that there may also be some dark horses that come. Not necessarily out of nowhere, but maybe ride that second wave once some of these regulatory issues are already sorted out.
We talked a little bit about investors and how to fund a startup. There's the Beta example, which is a little bit quieter, maybe a little bit more private funded. Joby, a little bit more public. Is venture capital the right way to fund an aviation startup, do you think, especially in a disruptive field like this?
Well, it's tough because, it depends on what are your options. So, obviously with aviation, you need, long-term patient investors who buy your vision. Venture capitalists, typically are looking to get their money back. And honestly, some of them did in the eVTOL industry. If you get the seed money and then there's an exit and, you can get out, maybe they serve a function there. I think that the right way to get money for an aviation startup is where you realistically can get it, because it can be difficult to get money for an aviation startup.
That is a great and pragmatic and realistic answer. Let's talk about automation, which is part of this story, although a slightly different technology than eVTOLs. Will automated aircraft, drones, whatever you want to call them, take over helicopter jobs before airplane jobs, or vice versa?
Well, there's certainly a lot of ways that you can take over helicopter jobs without having to take over, flying passengers in those aircraft. So certainly a lot of airplanes are focused on flying passengers, and I think for a lot of reasons that's going to be a slower sell for autonomy. There's aerial work things that you can do with helicopters that you can maybe take the pilot out without the social difficulties, let's say, associated with autonomy. So maybe.
All right, we talked about investing in the aviation business and how that can be a challenge. Let's talk about building the infrastructure. These eVTOLs are going to need somewhere to land if I'm going to get out of my office and walk right to my tilt rotor. So who are the real estate investors who are going to make out in this? Where should I be building a vertiport? Is it a parking garage? Is it an empty strip mall in the suburbs? Where do you think we'll actually see these landing?
Going to go back to my refrain about if I knew the answer to that, I'd be doing something else. I think it's going to really vary by the market and by the specific geography and use cases in each individual market. I don't think that there's any one answer. I think we're likely to see this industry evolve gradually. It's not like, certify the aircraft and overnight there's going to be hundreds of these things. So I think it'll evolve in a fairly organic way, where landing infrastructure makes sense along specific routes.
What can the helicopter industry teach the AAM industry about flying neighborly? A lot of helicopter operators do a lot to deal with noise complaints. You would think that will be an issue potentially with this industry. What are some lessons learned from the helicopter industry there?
I hate to say it, but they might teach the AAM industry what not to do. I think the helicopter industry has not been very successful at, managing noise and public perception and engaging with the public. And I think they've been in a very defensive position, because of it. And it's hard. Helicopters are noisy, right? It's there's a few options, but not a whole lot of options to make them quieter. And so, I would like to see the AAM industry with legitimately quieter technology, maybe, be a little more proactive in their engagements with the community.
What's the strangest helicopter you've ever flown?
So that would have to be the K-Max, which, if you're not familiar with the K-Max, I would recommend you Google it because it's a crazy looking helicopter. So it's a single seat helicopter with intermeshing rotor systems and produced by Kaman in Connecticut. The rotor blades are actually wooden, and it handles in some ways that do differ significantly from most of the rest of the helicopters out there.
Yeah, for anyone who hasn't seen a video of it flying, it looks like it shouldn't work, but somehow it seems to. So,
Sometimes.
what's your best advice for a beginning aviation journalist?
Oh, great question. I would say be passionate. I, yeah, it's such a cool industry, and if you're sincerely interested in it and interested in what you're writing about and open to learning, you're going to learn so much. And it's a very exciting industry. But yeah, the main thing is be passionate about what you're covering and what you're learning and try to do it justice.
You wrote a post many years ago about Chuck Yeagers' biography, which I think is a great book. Why is it worth reading?
Yes. You've dug deep on the internet for this. I'd almost completely forgotten about that. I think it's worth reading because uh, there's so much mythology built up around Chuck Yeager that it's almost difficult to distinguish between that mythology and just what it's like to actually be a pilot and to have to work hard at it every day. And yeah, I thought the biography was really illuminating in that sense in terms of just being really relatable to any pilot out there.
Yeah, I thought it was a great contrast you drew between that and The Right Stuff, which is a great book, but the Yeager biography may be a little more realistic of the grind that is that job sometimes, not all glory.
Exactly.
You live in Belize, so give us a travel tip. This is a place where people may have visited, maybe gotten off a cruise ship or something, but maybe haven't seen the real Belize. What's a off the beaten path place to visit or thing to do if I'm in that part of the world?
There is so much cool stuff to do in Belize that sometimes I feel like I'm working for the Belize Tourism Board, extolling its virtues. I will say that one of the really cool things I did recently was actually for my birthday. I went on a cave tour. So there's a company here called Ian Anderson's Caves Branch Lodge, and it's a nice resort, and they have a large property and a lot of private caves on their property. And my partner and I have done basically all of their tours at this point because the caves here are so cool. So big limestone caverns, and they're filled with ancient Mayan artifacts. And we did a private tour that went deep underground into this massive, just incredible cave. And at the very end of the cave, there's, after climbing down with ropes and wading through the river and so forth, you get to this chamber that's just incredible, and there's a crystallized human skull there, and it's a pretty unique experience. So I think the caves, if you're okay with caves, I know some people are not cool with caves or bats or whatever, but if you're up for caves, that's a pretty neat thing to see in Belize.
You had me at crystallized human skull. I think that's a first.
First time on the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a first. Congratulations. Not a first. Our last question on this podcast is always the same, and that is, you have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Okay, I'm really torn on this one because I could go two different ways, and one with an emphasis on what am I flying and one with an emphasis on where am I going. So, and I think that I would just have to choose on the day, kind of like sometimes you just have to wait till the waiter shows up at the table to decide what you're going to order for dinner. So if it's all about what I'm flying, I've always wanted to fly the Sikorsky Raider. I just think that would be super cool. So I would fly that thing anywhere. Yeah, that would be amazing. If it's where I'm going, I wouldn't mind throwing it back to my very first helicopter ride, which was in coastal British Columbia. I was on a travel writing assignment at the time, and went out and spent the day fly fishing. So the helicopter takes you out remote area and lands, and that was just such a magical experience. And I don't even care what type of helicopter takes me out there, but to recreate that was definitely special and launched my entire career in aviation.
That is the beauty of helicopters in particular, and aviation in general, the places it will take you. So, Elan, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.